Alright, so we're ready to start practicing and experimenting on the tone paper surface. And I'm going to start with some graphite pencils. It's going to be something soft so we can see how dark it can go. And I'll have my white colored pencil. So really the basics. One of the benefits here when we're working with our tone paper is understanding that we don't have to render as much as you would, let's say, on a regular graphite drawing. Because I can take and utilize my midtone in a way where when it's surrounded by something dark or surrounded by something light, it will appear to change in value. And that's something that we've referred to as simultaneous contrast. You've heard that term before, hopefully, and you can remember what that means. But I'll explain again. Ultimately, surrounding this tone with the light here makes that gray paper appear darker. Likewise, surrounding the gray paper by something dark makes the paper look brighter. One of the other things that we start to figure out is how we deal with the transitional stages between them. And my advice to you will be to avoid letting these elements of light and dark touch, but rather let the gray paper have some of its own play. Let it exist without any combination of the two media that I'm using here. Because if I did, let's say I let this fade lighter, and likewise brought this in very opaque at the beginning, fading it out. And when I'm doing this, I'm not necessarily scribbling back and forth. I'm making the mark on the downstroke back towards me. Could be doing it away from me. I find a little bit more control bringing it back towards me. And feathering the edge so the strokes don't build up lighter and darker necessarily. So like this works for me. What happens though if we start to say bring these two together and overlap it is a blueness to the mixture. In a lot of media, that white addition will appear to blue out the color. And so if you end up going into painting, you'll hear people telling you to tint your white with a warm, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of orange, just so it's not so cold. So this ends up looking cooler or blue compared to the other value, which is warmer over here. The gray of the paper is pretty neutral, but hopefully it's picking up here that this appears to be a bluer form. And really that's going to happen in other versions of this application. Let's say I went with a charcoal, and this is the Conte charcoal right now. In charcoal, it's going to be useful to have blending with a paper towel, with a Kleenex, with a nice piece of cotton or a chamois cloth, or your finger if nothing else. So that's the Conte pencil. Write that down. So it's graphite. Find my white charcoal here. Nice and opaque. And then slowly let it mix over top. These seem to blend a little bit better. So there's a little less of a color or temperature difference as we mix between those. So it's something you want to be careful of and be aware of what's happening. When I also do that, the hardness is going to smudge and I get a surface or textural difference there. So you've probably heard me talk about consistency in your application in other areas, especially with graphite. This is another occasion for that. If your form is represented going from black to white, and in the middle you have it smoothed out so significantly, it's going to bring a contrast that's so dramatic it's going to feel like it's a different surface. So if you do this, you absolutely need to bring the smoothness onto both sides. I'm smudging with a different finger so I don't introduce that white. And so at the very least, that's a little bit smoother of a transition. By doing that, it also opens up a little bit of room to apply more media, so you can experiment with how much that rubbing takes the texture of the paper away. The tone paper gets sort of obliterated in this case, so it is something that if you're being mindful of what you're doing and slowly getting to a value which is close to the mid-tone. And I'm working in small patches, so I could make this a little bigger, spread it out a little bit more. Move back to the white charcoal again. Again, trying to get it opaque. Just very light application here. The texture is consistent here in a different way. So it has more tooth, it has more texture, it has the paper visible. It's not blending between them, it's letting the cracks of the media here show the paper off. And so it's just a different version. Let's say we wanted to smooth it now. Put down a little media here, smudge it towards the tone. And by all means, keep an eye on which finger you're using for this so that your white and black don't mix on accident. You want to be in control of where that mixture happens. So if you have a paper towel or Kleenex to do this, then keep them separate. Make sure that one is associated with one and not used for both. So if I use my paper towel here, pull that texture back and away. So it's not, it's less drawing if I'm able to use the paper and show the paper through. There's a time and a place for the texture. There's a time and a place for smoothing things out. So it's a little bit about experimentation. And I want you to get to know the materials that you're going to use. So this is dry media right now. The pen application is going to be pretty similar. If we start to say, play with hatching or texture, I'm not crazy about getting into all cross-hatching techniques right now, so vary what you're doing. Experiment with this as well in terms of mark making. I'm just making a lot of little hatchy marks. If I get something deeper and bigger, I can avoid burning out my pen. But I will be looking for that to kind of transition over top of the smaller marks so it doesn't feel too noticeably different. So I end up really paying attention to the negative space, the ground that shows through there. And then I might throw a couple other little pieces of mark making back up into it. Unfortunately, my gel pen doesn't come in a brush. So start in a similar way here with the stipples moving out and away. That makes a lovely noise scratching across the surface. But if you do have some white gouache, you could introduce some marks that are going to be similar. If there's a benefit about the paper color right now, the paper is not quite a mid-tone, it's a little bit lighter than mid-tone, so it does sort of shift the balance here, where you end up doing a little bit more drawing with the dark, and the white is used a little bit more sparingly. But get to know this, get to experiment with it. I'll save the gouache for another video. Play with a few gradients, back and forth, back and forth. What's going to work well? When does this look kind of awkward? And make sure that you've tried and experimented with that simultaneous contrast. So use the test page to get to know the media that you want to use and get comfortable with it. All right?